All right, we got odds and ends today, so bear with me as this is gonna seem a bit ADD. I might jump from one thing to the next. What are we doing? Well, I have to create a jig to align the ailerons, which were recently completed, in a neutral position so that we can use that to hook up the linkage. Speaking of linkage, I have to create some push rods and various assemblies to help get the control from the cockpit to the ailerons. And then I also have to get the flaps clamped in place, but their position is based a little bit on the ailerons. So let's start with ailerons. I have some metal strips. This is just Home Depot aluminum bar, and they are going to be fabricated into sort of some guides for the ailerons. They're gonna get bolted to the outboard rib and be used as a gauge and sort of an alignment tool. So, starting with that, I've got a line scribed down the middle. You probably can't see it, but it's there. I got a starting hole down here I'm going to drill, and then I'm going to measure where the subsequent holes are. Moving on up, let's get to it. Got my Sharpie in there, and I'm just sweeping a little arc on the back side of this. So what's the deal? Does it work? I think so. It might not lock them in place as well as I was hoping, but I do have some clamps doing that, and it certainly works as a really good indicator of if they're up or down, and it does sort of hold them directly neutral. So I'm good with it. What's up next? We got to paint, prime, I should say, some parts for the push rods, and I don't know that there's any great way to do this, but I'm going to try a way that I thought up of, and we'll see if that works. So now we've got to fabricate this big long push rod, two of them in fact, one for each wing, and it needs to be primed inside and out. We'll worry about the outside in a minute. That's why I have these stood up like this. They'll get primed, but a little separately. First I'm going to worry about the inside. Now one way to do it is to cap off the end of the tube, pour primer in there, slosh it around, pour the excess primer back out. Seems like it could be a disaster, a mess. Now, granted, my way seems like it could be a mess too, but I'm still gonna give it a whirl. I have an extra big cotton swab. I'm gonna put it in one end. I'm gonna similarly fill the tube with primer, but probably a lot less than would be required to slosh it around. And I'm just gonna pull this through and see if I can't effectively swab the whole inside with primer. So, worth a try, right? Alright, while that concoction's brewing, I've got this smaller tube here that needs to be cut to a pretty specific dimension. 23 and 13/16. So, the last half hour has really just allowed me to think about the myriad ways this is inevitably going to go wrong and why it's not that great of an idea. But I'm going to try it anyways. It's creating suction in there. It's an interesting thing I hadn't thought about. which means likely it's sucking all of the paint down below the swab. I wonder if I can poke a hole in the other end. But if there's a bunch of paint out there on that side, it's going to come flowing out. Well, that's honestly what I wanted to see. All right, let's get the embarrassing bit out of the way. I didn't realize what I made right up until the end there and what it looks like, and we'll just call it what it is, a primer tampon. Would I recommend going that route? It did the trick, I think. I think it worked. Got like full coverage on all the walls. I was able to look in there, and I've got my borescope, and I can verify clean coverage. I didn't use as much primer as I thought. I'm not trying to slosh it all around. The one unexpected thing is that I taped off the end to make sure if things did make it past that squeegee, that it didn't come out and gush all over the garage floor. And I didn't realize that I was creating suction in there, and then that's pulling the primer through from the front side of the squeegee. And so, that I went back and I bled it a little bit. I created a small pinhole, but I could still hear kind of air trying to equalize that pressure. And then when it came out the other side, yes, I did have a little excess primer. I wanted to see that. Yeah, I didn't want to, run out of primer, but it wasn't huge and it was controllable. So I think it worked out pretty well. I like it. Let's keep moving. So that is the midpoint of the pipe, and you can see how uniform that primer coverage is. That's what I like to see. Well, these big long rivets are what go through here, and Vans seems to have quite a bit of faith in me, because I need 8 and I've been given 9. Turns out I didn't even need 8 of the 12s, because those are way too long. They just want to fold over. I had some 11s. They were about perfect. I like how they look. 12s, too long. Grease will ooze out of these as you tighten it up. It's a little messy. The pipe cutter didn't leave a great edge, so what little time I saved is shot trying to file these things down, but I would have had to deburr anyways, not too big of a deal. Drilling's pretty simple. The first hole, a little hard to line up. Putting the rod end bearing in the end of the fitting there helps you kind of hold it into position. Once that first hole is made, it's not going to go anywhere. I punched right through, doing 2 holes at once. Seeing that drill come through right on my mark on the backside let me know I was doing something right. I then made sure to mark each one A, B, C, D. Not only that, after deburring, I marked sort of a keyway so that I knew how to align it. After priming, they might be a little harder to twist in there. This way, I know I can line it right up, get those rivets set. Let's talk primer for a second. By far, the #1 question I get is, what primer are you using? Up to now, I've been using the Axo Noble primer. It's really specified for aircraft. It is a quick-drying 2-part epoxy primer, incredibly durable, and I've loved this stuff. So why would you switch? Well, Up to now, I've been dealing with parts that you're not really going to see. They've been the interior of the airframe. And starting with the linkage and the push rods, these are parts that are going to be in the cockpit of the airplane. And I'm not too fond of that World War II zinc chromate green look. So I've been searching high and low for a white primer. What I've found is a product from Eastwood. It's a little more geared towards general fabrication and automotive purposes. But let's face it, we shouldn't have a whole lot of corrosive fluids in the cockpit. It is supposedly a quick dry product. It's a bright white. It's sort of checked every box I was looking for. So starting with these pieces, I'm gonna give that stuff a try. I'll also be shooting it through a new gun, the same cheapy gun that I've been using, this time with an on-gun regulator, but figured it's about time to get a new one. Those are semi-disposable. It'll be nice to have a fresh start with the gun. Jury's still out on that. We'll see how I wind up liking it. Took a little while to get used to. It's definitely a little thicker, but by the end I got less of a spatter, more of a spray. I think it's going to be good stuff. Now to get going on the bell crank and some other pieces inside the wing. Let's do it. So first things first, the brackets have to come off the spar. There's just simply no room to get bolts in and out. So those have to be pulled. We'll build the assembly on the bench and then put everything back in. Now the next thing we're supposed to do is drill this out so that the bolt slides easily on it. I think they've got that one covered for us. So I'm not going to drill this out. It doesn't make any sense. We don't want it fitting loose. After that, this brass bushing goes in here. Now, it's long. It needs to be long, but it doesn't need to be that long. So I've marked it a little bit with some blue Sharpie. And what we're going to try and do is shave just a little off so that it will be squeezed between these brackets and the bell crank will rotate around that. We want the brackets to squeeze this and not this. But again, that 1/8 of an inch that's hanging out is a bit too much. I'm going to take all but maybe a 32nd of that off. Alright, now we got them so they're just barely anything showing out on either side. Alright, so each wing requires us to fabricate 3 spacers. There is a spacer on one of the aileron hinges attaching the aileron to the wing. There is a spacer on the push rod connection point between the aileron and the push rod that goes from the aileron to the bell crank. And last, there's a spacer on the bell crank itself. All of those need to be cut from a 5/8 diameter tube made from aluminum. We get in the kit 3 pairs. One is a 9-inch length. That is a push rod, I think for the flaps. We don't want to cut it up. The other is a shorter length. This is a spacer used on the bulkhead on the center portion of the wing. Don't want to cut that either. You get 2 pieces of 5/8 diameter 4-inch tubing. And from that, each 4-inch piece, you should be able to get the 3 spacers required for each wing. One for the left, one for the right. Alright, so I got 3 spacers. Why 3 when I need 6? I'm not totally confident in my methods here, so we're going to do one wing, and if everything works out, we'll do the other. So what I've wound up doing is sort of playing a game of ring toss here with the washers and the bolt, fishing them in with this little probe. The loose washers mean that my spacing is incorrect from outboard to inboard edge of the aileron, which required removing everything and shifting some washers around on the inboard hinge to get the outboard hinge to fit, which is what you see here. It's on. That took a bit of doing. Some tricks is the little tape trick with the washer in order to fish it in there and get it. That saved my life, along with having a good set of probes. And as I mentioned, playing ring toss with the bolt in the washer and guiding it with a probe. The push rod, the linkage is there. I need the push tube to go from the cockpit over to the bell crank. So we're going to take a look, see if that primer's dry. If it is, we're going to start making a push tube. It looks nice. It's not my best paint work, but it'll do. It still feels just barely tacky, but I think I can work with it without mucking it up. And you know me, I'm impatient. We're going to get to work. So I got a little ahead of myself. Big surprise, right? What I forgot to do was use the aileron alignment jig or alignment bracket to zero out the bell crank so that I could adjust the length of the first push rod. Now it's pretty easy. It just slides over the attachment bolt. Once it's flat against the spar, your aileron should be neutral. Now I have that nifty little jig that kind of locks my aileron in neutral. And so once those two things are in place, all I have to do is adjust the length of that push rod via those tie rod bearings until everything fits perfectly. It took a couple screws out, had to lengthen it about 1/8 of an inch, and now we're set. All right, this is really cool. The linkage is set. It works. It's kind of fun to play with. The only bad news in all of this is that the primer was not quite ready, even though it had several hours. There's some fingerprints in what I was working on because it was still a little soft. Not the end of the world for the part, but more what it means for the future build of the fuselage is that I'm gonna have to time my pieces a little better because it's gonna take at least a full 12 hours for these things to cure. And you know me, I don't like to wait. I think you can probably see why I went with the white. I think it looks great in the wing with the rest of the white hardware. And again, it's gonna be a great introduction into that cockpit where everything else is white. Couple things here. Yes, I do plan on having an autopilot servo in there. Yes, I'm probably gonna have to reverse some of the work that I just did in order to install said autopilot servo. I just don't have the hardware yet. Haven't really made a decision on avionics. We'll get there. I like how this worked. I did have to swap one washer from one side of a bracket to the other in order to get things to line up. That is normal. It's to be expected, and in fact, the instructions even call for the ability to move those around. So next up is just to do the exact same thing on the right wing, and then I can move on to the next step. Let's do it. Right wing went together very, very quickly once you know what you're doing. With that, the wings are almost there. What I want to do is prep the bottom wing skins and get them just up to the point of riveting so that when I am ready to do that, I have that chore taken care of. Now, I don't usually have a problem removing the plastic. It doesn't bother me too much. It's a little tedious, but usually goes pretty quick. But for those folks who absolutely hate it, I'll show you a trick. This is not something I came up with, but it is something I wanted to show you. For large flat pieces, I gotta admit, it's pretty efficient. Okay, so the easiest way I can think of to explain how I'm aligning the flap is this. I have a laser pointer set up and the beam is running parallel with the trailing edge of the aileron. I'm adjusting the flap so that the beam continues to run parallel to the trailing edge of the flap. Meaning, I'm adjusting the very inboard edge of the trailing edge of the flap so that the beam is the same height above it as the aileron. Now, one thing that makes adding the flaps on a little more difficult is that this bracket doesn't really want to stay in its spot. In fact, you kind of have to cleco it to the wing skin in order to get it to stay where it wants to go. The problem is you can't cleco it to the wing skin with the flap on because the flap doesn't have holes to cleco yet. That's what we're trying to do in the first place. So the idea is I'm adding cleco clamps where I can, and then we're just going to have to add some pressure and align this by hand manually until I can get a couple holes drilled, and then we can have the clecos. Now, drilling the holes is the scary part because, as you saw with the laser beam and all that, we want to ensure that these holes are being drilled when the flap is exactly parallel and aligned with the aileron. You can see here that I'm using a cleco clamp to hold it, but it doesn't quite want to hold. In fact, that bracket still wants to spring up just a little bit. And so that's where we're going to have to add some pressure to hold it, making sure that everything is exactly where we want it. Once we're satisfied, I can then poke a couple holes in there and add some clecos. That'll give it some mechanical fastening where it can't move. And then hopefully it's in the right spot and I can go and rip along, drilling the rest of the hinge into the skin and the bracket. Once that's all set, I can either add clecos or, and this is probably what I'm going to do, break it down a little bit, deburr, dimple the skins, which I haven't done yet, and then cleco it back together. Okay, so there's the line that I marked right down the midpoint of that hinge, and now I know where in that hole that line needs to be. It needs to be just towards the top point of that hole, the whole way across the flap. And so now I can kind of spot it and drill the holes and get this hinge clecoed in place. And that's it. The wings are done. Okay, they're not done. There's a lot to do. I have the bottom skins, and before I have the bottom skins, I have all the wiring. I have the heated pitot and the pitot controller. I have the wing tips. I have the wing tip lighting and the wiring that goes with that. In fact, I have enough to overwhelm me all over again. However, I'm going to kick all that down the field a little bit. There's parts that I'm not equipped to handle yet, and there's parts that you don't want to handle, like the wing tips, until you're handling the fiberglass for the rest of the plane. So for now, the wings are done. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to get them seated in a garage in an area where I can then build a fuselage. If you can believe it, I'm going to try and fit that in here with the wings at the same time. Not sure it's going to work. I'm also going to take some time to get the garage cleaned up, reorganized, and ready for a whole new chapter of this project. I'm going to take some time to admire the wings. This is a pretty cool milestone. And then next time we meet, we're going to open up that box for the fuselage. If you're liking the build so far, go ahead and give me a thumbs up. And if you want to see that fuselage get built, don't forget to subscribe. I will see you next time. Thank you.